Hello and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amaris. Today we're going to look at some rather famous carvings located on a rather out-of-the-way island. The reference photo I'm using is by Flickr user Lee Corsi, and I'll leave a link to it in the description box below. Somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, farther from any continent than almost any other inhabited place on Earth, there is an island that has no business being as famous as it is. It measures just 163 square kilometers. You could walk its entire coastline in a day. It has no rivers and no natural harbor. And for most of human history, the nearest humans were more than 2,000 kilometers away. And yet, this small, wind-scoured triangle of volcanic rock is one of the most recognizable places on the planet. Not because of its beaches or its cities, but because of the faces. Row upon row of enormous stone heads, some as tall as a 4-story building, some weighing more than a blue whale, stare out across the landscape with a gravity that stops you in your tracks. These are the Moai of Rapa Nui, Easter Island. And today, as I paint 2 of them, I want to tell you their story. It is a story of extraordinary human ambition, of ingenuity and catastrophe, and ultimately of resilience. So let's begin at the beginning. Around 300 to 900 Common Era, historians still debate the exact date, a group of Polynesian voyagers set out from somewhere in eastern Polynesia and sailed east into the unknown. They had no maps. They navigated only by the stars, by ocean swells, by the flight patterns of birds, and somehow, seemingly impossibly, they found this island. Think about what that means. These were people crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean in wooden canoes, reading the Pacific the way we might read a street sign. The precision required is almost incomprehensible. The Polynesian tradition of wayfinding is, by any honest human measure, one of the greatest feats of navigation in the history of our species. The people who arrived on that island called it Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world, and they called themselves Rapa Nui. Over the centuries that followed, they built something that the world had never seen before and has never quite seen again. The island the settlers arrived on was not the barren place we see today. When those first canoes were dragged up onto the shore, the island was covered in forest. Dense subtropical woodland thick with the toromiro tree, with palms and ferns. It had rich soil enough to grow sweet potatoes, taro, and sugarcane. There were birds nesting in the trees by the millions, and the sea was abundant with fish and dolphins. In other words, a paradise. By roughly 1000 CE, the Rapa Nui people had established a thriving society. At some point, no one knows exactly when the impulse first struck, they began to carve. The Moai were not just statues. This is the first thing to understand about them, and perhaps the most important. They were aringa ora, living faces, physical embodiments of the spirits of important ancestors. To the Rapa Nui, the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable. Your ancestors were not gone, they were present and they were powerful. Carving a Moai was a way of anchoring that ancestral power to a specific place and for the benefit of the living community. The Moai faced inland, almost all of them, watching over the villages and the people they were meant to protect. They were not looking out to sea. They were looking at you. Now here's where it gets extraordinary. All of the Moai, nearly every single one, were carved from the same quarry. A volcanic crater called Rano on the eastern side of the island. This crater, over the course of several centuries, became one of the greatest sculptural workshops in human history. Walk into Ranararaku today, and the effect is deeply, viscerally strange. There are nearly 400 moai still there, some finished, some half-finished, and some barely begun, embedded in the slopes as though the volcano itself is giving birth to them. The largest one ever started was never completed. If it had been, it would have stood over 21 meters tall and weighed around 270 tons. It would have been taller than a 6-story building. The workers used basalt stone picks, harder than the volcanic tuff they were carving into, and they worked from the top down, sculpting the face first, then the body, then undercutting the figure from the rock face and sliding it downward onto the crater floor. And then came the part that nobody, for a very long time, could fully explain. They moved them. How do you move a stone figure that weighs between 10 and 80 tons across kilometers of uneven volcanic terrain with no machinery, no draft animals, and not even wheels? For decades, this question was one of the great puzzles of archaeology. Some people, and we should say this plainly, use this puzzle to suggest that the Rapa Nui could not have done it themselves, that it must have been some other more advanced civilization, or aliens. This idea is not just wrong, it's insulting. The Rapa Nui were skilled, intelligent, and resourceful people. The mystery of the Moai is not whether they built them, it's simply how. Several theories have been tested over the years. One of the most compelling, supported by oral tradition, and confirmed through modern experiments, is almost poetic in its simplicity. The Moai walked. Upright, rocking from side to side, guided by ropes, teams of people pulling and steadying, tilting the statue forward with each rock, like you might move a heavy refrigerator. Experiments in 2012 demonstrated convincingly that a team of around 18 people could move a 5-ton Moai replica this way at a reasonable pace. For the largest Moai, the teams would have been much bigger and the process much slower, but entirely possible. There is even linguistic evidence. In the Rapa Nui language, the word for how the statues were moved translates roughly as "they walked." Their own oral history remembered it exactly right. Once transported, the Moai were erected on ceremonial stone platforms called ahu. These platforms were impressive in their own right. Carefully fitted stones, some weighing several tons each, arranged without mortar. The largest ahu, Ahu Tangariki, holds 15 Moai standing in a row. Standing in front of them as the sun rises is said to be one of those rare travel experiences that simply silences you. And then there is one final detail that is easy to miss in photographs, but changes everything when you know it. Many of the Moai originally wore hats. Red cylindrical hats carved from a different type of volcanic rock, a red scoria quarried at a separate site called Punapau. These hats, called pukau, could weigh up to 12 tons. Hoisting a 12-ton stone cylinder onto the head of a statue that was already standing upright required a level of engineering ingenuity that researchers are still studying. The leading theory is that the pukau were rolled up ramps, perhaps using the same rocking technique, and maneuvered into place. The hats, combined with white coral eyes that were placed in the Moai's eye sockets during ceremonies, would have given these figures a vivid, almost luminous presence. They were not the gray, eyeless forms we see today. In their prime, they were colorful, dynamic, and alive. And then something went terribly wrong. The common story goes that European visitors reported population numbers a fraction what they had been at the height of Rapa Nui's culture, and perhaps most strikingly, many of the Moai had been toppled over, deliberately, by the Rapa Nui themselves. What happened? The honest answer is that it's complicated, and that the simplified version of the story itself has caused great harm. For many years, the standard narrative was this: The Rapa Nui multiplied, competed, chopped down all their forests to move their statues, exhausted their resources, descended into warfare and cannibalism, and collapsed. The island was held up as a cautionary tale, an ecocide, a parable of civilization destroying itself through short-sighted greed. It's a compelling story. It is also, in many important ways, wrong, or at least drastically incomplete. Yes, the forests were largely gone by the time Europeans arrived. Yes, the Moai construction probably contributed to deforestation, as timber would have been needed for moving the statues and as fuel. And yes, there is evidence of social conflict in the later period. But researchers in recent years have pushed back hard on the idea of a pre-contact collapse. When the earliest European explorers arrived, the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen, who landed on Easter Sunday in 1722, giving the island the name we still use today, and Spanish visitors in 1770. They reported that the Moai were all standing. Studies of ancient soil, pollen records, and carbon dating suggest that the Rapa Nui adapted creatively to environmental change. They developed sophisticated lithic mulching techniques, covering their gardens with stones to retain moisture and enrich soil, that allowed agriculture to continue even as the forest disappeared. The population declined, but it did not collapse catastrophically before European contact. What did cause catastrophic decline was, overwhelmingly, European contact itself. Roggeveen's visit in 1722 was followed by others, Spanish, French, British, and with each visit came the familiar devastating instruments of colonialism. Introduced disease to which the Rapa Nui had no immunity, violence, and eventually, in the 1860s, something particularly horrific. Peruvian slave raiders carried off roughly 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including most of the island's leadership, its priests, and its knowledge keepers, to work in the guano mines of the Chincha Islands. When international pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors, smallpox broke out on the return voyage. Only about 100 people made it back alive, and those survivors brought smallpox home with them. By 1877, the entire Rapa Nui population had been reduced to 111 people. The oral histories, the traditions, the knowledge of how to read Rongo Rongo, the island's unique undeciphered script, which was one of the very few independently invented writing systems in human history, almost everything was lost. This is why many of the Moai were toppled. Not because of self-inflicted ecological disaster, but because the social and political structure that had given rise to them had been shattered. During periods of interclan warfare in the later period, toppling a rival clan's Moai, depriving them of their ancestral power, was a profound act of aggression. The Moai being face down was significant. It rendered them powerless. Today, Rapa Nui is a special territory of the country of Chile, though the relationship is complicated and contested. The native Rapa Nui community has long advocated for greater autonomy and recognition of their land rights, and the Chilean government has in recent years moved, slowly, to address some of these concerns. The population has recovered. There are now roughly 8,000 people living on the island, and the Rapa Nui culture is experiencing a genuine revival. The island's most famous residents, the Moai, are protected as part of Rapa Nui National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Conservation is an ongoing challenge. The statues are slowly, irreversibly being eroded by rain, wind, and salt air. Some have been damaged by tourism. In 2022, a fire, likely started by drought-parched vegetation, scorched around 60 hectares near Rano Rakaru, damaging Moai that had survived for centuries. There are 1,043 Moai in total. Of those, just over 300 have been erected on their ahu platforms. The rest remain in and around Rano Raraku, or were toppled and never re-erected, or are stored in museums around the world, a fact that the Rapa Nui people have increasingly and reasonably asked to revisit. Some of the most significant moai sit in collections in Santiago, London, Brussels, and Washington, D.C. The conversations about their return are ongoing. There's one little addendum to the story that I couldn't bring myself to leave out. The Toromiro tree, the native tree of Easter Island, the one that covered the island when those first settlers arrived, went completely extinct in the wild. The last known individual of the species died on the island in the mid-20th century. But a Swedish botanist named Carl Scottsberg had collected seeds from the last tree during an expedition in 1956. Those seeds made their way to the Gothenburg Botanical Garden in Sweden, and today descendants of that last wild Toromiro tree are being cultivated carefully and slowly with the hope of one day reintroducing them to Rapa Nui. That tree that helped build the world of the Moai may yet return to the island where the Moai stand. There's something in that which feels to me like the right note to end the story on. The Moai are strange and familiar at once. Their features are stylized, almost abstract. Long, heavy brows, the sharp, jutting chins, the elongated ears. They're not trying to be realistic portraits. They're trying to capture something more essential. The weight of an ancestor, the permanence of lineage, the power of memory expressed in stone. When the Rapa Nui carved a Moai, they were insisting that the people who came before us do not simply disappear, that they can be called upon, that they watch over us, that we owe them something, and what we owe them is not to forget. There is something in that, something in the sheer, monumental stubbornness of these figures that speaks to something very old and very human. We all want to leave a mark. We all want to be remembered. We all have ancestors looking over our shoulders, for better or for worse. The Rapa Nui said it louder and in stone, and it has lasted 1,000 years. Watercolor paper is not as durable as stone, but I hope this painting at least lasts a little while too. Thank you so much for coming with me on this exploration of the Moai of Rapa Nui. If you've enjoyed this little journey, I'd love it if you'd join me for future episodes. See you next time.